Thank you. The Committee of the Whole is back in session. I'm going to have the clerk reread the language that's in the agenda.
Overview of the 2014-2015 biennial budget, including a broad overview of the budget proposal and department-by-department summary of key issues and changes.
Okay. We're appreciative of having the budget books on time and on schedule. Thank you. And my understanding is that Director Rubino is going to do the full presentation today. So I would ask you to please come forward and make that presentation. And then when you're done with your presentation, then we're going to start questioning from this end today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt Rubino, Office of Budget Management. I have a basic overview of the recommended budget for 14 to 15, some of the high points, and obviously we'll have question and answers afterwards. You do have the full recommended budget document, and the print shop did a great job of turning that around for us today. So we have books. We're going to be doing a second run. We do a real quick run of 25. We'll have additional books printed out this week, and we'll have them in our office. So if you need more copies, let us know, and we'll get more copies of the actual book. We just did a small batch today, so we could get books completed. With that, I'll go right into the presentation. 2014-15. It's our second go at this biennial budget process, which is, I think, a good thing. Let's just start with our high-level priorities, our strategic priorities when we develop the budget plan or the operating plan of the county. As we know, it's a statement of our priorities, of course. Now, balancing estimated resources with programmatic expenditures. We've talked about that over and over in committee meetings, in regular council. So always had that front and center. There's other things, but I like to highlight that first. Support of economic development, job creation. In particular is defined in the economic development plan of the county, but also in the Western Reserve program. So providing funding for those important programs. The continuation to improve efficiency in county government, and then direct savings to strategic priorities that flow through this document for 14 to 15. And again, using the resources in a manner that produces measurable outcomes. So critical and ongoing component of what we do at the county. Maintaining critical programs and services to protect the most vulnerable populations in Cuyahoga County. That really cuts to not just the things we do in general, but also when we talk about health and human services at the county, knowing that we have, for at least this point in time, revenue loss and how we're going to contend with that. The recommended budget is one proposed way of doing that, knowing that there are other things that are going to take place in the next few weeks when it comes to additional revenue. But again, if we submit a recommended budget that assumes no new revenue, how do we preserve what is critical to the county's health and human services network? And how do we utilize resources to accomplish that? And we'll get more into that in a bit. And again, improving education for the county's children through investment in early childhood and the college savings account program. Let's talk quickly on parameters. This is the starting point. I think we may have had a little bit of discussion on this item. When we talk about going to develop the budget, we know what things we want to accomplish, what things are important, what things do we want to fund and preserve. That's the high level. So when we start off, as I mentioned before, we use our quarterly review process really as a springboard and entrance into budget development. Budget development is cyclical, doesn't have a finite beginning or end for the county. But when we chop it up in nice little pieces, for us, we complete second quarter report where we think we're at for both the current year and for 2014, which is the first budget year. And we start there. So a lot of that work is done at the detail level by Office and Budget Management staff working with county agencies. The formal kickoff of that process, or revealing that process, was a transmittal memo that was sent out to all county agencies at the beginning of September. So behind the scenes, we're developing starting points. How do we want to construct or base the allocations, the numbers that are going to be in the recommended budget ultimately? What assumptions do we want to use for revenue and expenditures, and how do we develop what we call the initial base numbers or initial starting point for budget? So this slide just breaks down, I guess it's the stereo instructions to the budget, but how do we look at the lines that we're going to use to craft a budget to mirror those strategic priorities we talked about earlier, And how do we develop the actual initial budget numbers? And this bulleted list just gives you an idea. Talk about revenue. Most important part of any budget is revenue. We take a look at the work we've been doing for evaluating revenue trends and available sources for programs. We use the work of second quarter for 13, 14, and beyond to develop the base numbers for revenue. And we'll talk more on revenue assumptions in a subsequent slide. Then a large part of the budget is core salary and fringe benefits. And those were based on current projected levels that would include approved positions, whether they're filled or not. So the budget, the starting point at least, take a look at what the approved staffing level is for every county program. And we carry those into the 14 and 15 starting budgets, the initial budget. And we're also factoring in vacancies that have been approved. If there's transition going on in different agencies, that's also included. And again, a lot of that work was done as part of second quarter. And it goes back to, I know we've had questions before, whether the county utilize a zero-based budget approach. Well, using our work of the quarterly review is the zero-based aspect of what we have in Cuyahoga, which is really a hybrid approach to budget development. It's a little bit of zero-based, it's a little bit of incremental, it's also priority and program-based. So the zero-based piece is when we take a look at, here's what we've discovered as part of our review process right before we start budget development. How do we factor that in to the numbers that we're developing for the initial starting point? Bit of good news for healthcare costs. It seems year over year, the employee or the employer impact, the impact on county operating funds for the employer contribution to healthcare, we usually have every year some sort of escalation, usually 3 to 5%. For 14, based on the performance of the county self-insurance program for healthcare, we're actually able to keep the budgetary impact flat. So that's a savings. Normally, again, we're looking at 3 to 5% every year based on the reserves we have built up because of claims that are over 12% lower than anticipated. We're able to keep, for at least for 14, the county portion of healthcare cost flat. So it's a good thing. We also have a bit of an inflationary parameter applied generally to other operating expenses. So we're looking at ongoing contracts, supplies, commodities, utilities. We're applying a 2% growth factor. In some areas or some instances, that growth factor is not used. That's at the discretion of the analyst working with their individual budgets. And for some items like utilities, we're not going with a 2%, we're going with something higher based on input we get from the facilities management group. Budget lines for service contracts, especially in the area of health and human services, we're looking at 2013 levels. And that goes back to a lot of times you'll see a provider contract that may be a not to exceed amount. Maybe it's not to exceed 5 million. But when it comes to developing the budget, we'll look at what the anticipated use of that particular service is when we craft the budget. And so we're only looking at appropriating what's in the current year, knowing that obligation for those types of contracts from the previous year does roll forward and gets added to the appropriation in the starting point. So that's another key thing to remember when we're talking about that type of contract. The cuts that we've had to endure from the previous state biennial budget and some of the changes in the current biennial budget are carried through 14 and 15. So the obvious ones being the reduction in property tax reimbursements from the state, local government fund, we're familiar with that. Some of the other reductions to direct assistance from Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services, those are at the levels that were reset in 2012-13, but then updated based on information we have received from the state for the starting of the new state fiscal year. Any additional requests for funding, when we get to the next step, they're evaluated separately from base development. So this is how do we come up with a starting point that accurately reflects the approved ongoing budget allocations of county programs. So any additional requests for funding are taken as the next part of the process. And they're in the context of available funding, whether it's general fund or some other source, but also priority. We talk about the county's financial and budgetary policies. We have a well-defined spectrum of what budget priorities are, and we use that information when we're evaluating requests. Counties with self-supporting, this is the last point on base development, I'll move on. Counties with self-supporting revenue, so for example, road and bridge, they collect revenue from gasoline tax, from auto title fees. Programs that are self-funded, self-supported are limited to the available revenue in the current year or in the balance of the particular operating fund when it comes to requesting additional appropriation or additional budgetary allocation. So the next step is we develop this initial starting point on this straightforward set of parameters, at least we consider it straightforward, maybe it's not. And then we do some refining. And this is what The previous step was more detail, a little more number crunching. The next step is refinement. We like to call it the human intervention piece of budget development. So we don't have one computer system application that takes all the numbers, crunches them, and comes up with some sort of final budget. That's just the starting piece. The next step is a good month-long process of review by not just our staff, but county agency staff, and then communication. So sitting down with fiscal managers and business managers and court administrators and directors and talking about, here's the initial starting point. Here's what we know you're approved to do in 13 and going to 14. Have them review, explain what they need to look at in the base numbers. And part of that process, an important component of that process, is a set of training sessions that we conducted back in September. And it's something we've done over the years, but we have county agency fiscal staff administrators, whoever would like to, come to the computer lab. We walk through a lot of the stuff we're talking about today. Base parameters, what are the priorities of the budget, but also what type of information should you be reviewing and what does it mean? And if you want to request a change or something additional, how do you do that? So we conducted four separate sessions. I think we had close to over 50 individual county agency staff come in and take part in the sessions. So it's one part information, one part training, how to use the reporting system and understand what you're being provided in the budget report. So that's part of this refinement process, because a lot of two-way communication is important. So there's an understanding that this is the starting point. If there's omissions or corrections that need to be made, well, we provide an outlet for that, and we try to communicate that. So the types of refinements that happen during this base budget piece of budget development are things such as adding the impact of staffing requests that have been approved in 13 that maybe weren't accounted for in the latest projection, or there's been some change in a particular agency is going to change the classification of a staff. So a lot of it is going through line by line for every county agency and making sure we've accommodated what they've been approved to do in 13 through 14, especially when it comes to staffing. So if we're missing something, we'll add that in. If something needs to be taken out, we'll remove it. Many adjustments to contracts and client services. There's a pie chart coming up in a little bit. You'll see how much the county deploys in terms of resources to accomplish things through contractual services or service providers. So there's a lot of information and a lot that gets done by way of contractual and other types of services. So we spend a lot of time refining the individual contracts and obligations that agencies have. So we're making sure we're accommodating the correct level of budget for those ongoing agreements. Any adjustments to revenue? We're updating revenue once a month, but we're also looking to county agency experts. They know their revenue streams as well as our staff, so work with them and decide if maybe something needs to be adjusted. When it comes to revenue, especially for a self-supported budget, revenue being the most important piece of any budget, if we want to make sure we're very close to what we think an honest and accurate estimate is for revenue. And then any realignments of appropriation within program budgets. Agencies have some discretion, some entrepreneurial discretion within their budgets. They can realign appropriation as long as it's not going out of scope of what they're supposed to accomplish. So they may come to us with adjustments within their individual line item budgets. A large county agency such as Public Works may have 30 plus individual divisional budgets, and a lot of those have separate funding sources. They may want to realign within the budgets of the same funding source. So that's an example where they may do some realignments or request that. So base budget refinement, that whole process, we actually end up adding budgetary allocation. It's not a budget increase. It's part of the realignment or truing up of what the budget should be based on all the information we know. And that was about $24 million of adjustments for 14. Again, these are, I wouldn't say technical nature, but they're making the budget more accurate. It's not to increase a program scope necessarily or to increase what we're doing. It's to make sure the base budget, the budget, the starting point plus the adjustments is accurate, an accurate reflection of what the expectation is to accomplish in 14 and 15. And then $25.6 million in 2015. All this information is, the narrative, the detail is maintained in a separate reporting system. So we have reporting available to our staff, fiscal officer, and county agencies so they understand why we're making changes. And the list on this slide is just an example of some of the more significant upward adjustments and actually some reductions as we get through this refinement process. Board of Developmental Disabilities, they craft their own budget. They provide us what their budget's going to be, and then we update our numbers to match the board's recommended budget for their organization. And we had some increases for health insurance contracts and workers' compensation, self-insurance, public safety, county sheriff. There were some additional base adjustments for prosecutor and public defender based on some discussion meetings that they had with council over the past few months. And then some reductions to facilities costs, the fiscal office, and the way the MedMart, or now the Global Center, operating account is going to function going into next year. With some of the changes taking place on how the facility operates, there's going to be a reduction in how much general fund dollars the county is flowing to the operation. So that was another adjustment. The details on these adjustments, and I'll illustrate with some examples later on, are in the individual departmental sections of the budget book. So for any particular agency, we're documenting what types of base adjustments were made and why, and what the changes from 13 budget. Now we get into the actual adjustments, increases and decreases to the base budget. So after the base is established, requests or targeted reductions get incorporated into the base budget. So that's I guess would be the third major piece of developing the recommended budget. It's now looking at projected fund balances for general fund and levy and for other operating funds, and determining, in order to be in balance, but also to match and make sure we're allotting enough resources for the strategic priorities, what types of adjustments do we need to make, in particular to general fund and levy fund. And we do this every time we either develop a biennial budget or we update a biennial budget. We do this process from year to year. It differs. We're always making adjustments to the base. So for the 14 and 15 biennium, as you know, when we projected for second quarter, we had about a $9 million imbalance in the general fund. So we identified targeted reductions for the general fund of over $8.5 million to make sure the recommended budget for general fund for 14 and 15 is in balance, and it is. And I don't have a lot, well, I'll come back to the next slide. $8.5 million in targeted cuts to executive agencies. So we did not go to elected officials and outside boards for target reductions. We looked at the operation of executive agencies, knowing where are the various pressure points, where is the administrative overhead, where are vacant positions, and what are the other areas of cost that we can either implement some sort of efficiency or some management change that would help produce some level of savings to the general fund. And that $8.5 million represents, that's an average, it's about 8.4 in 2014 and 8.6 plus in 2015. So we identified targeted reductions that have general fund impact to county executive agencies totaling $8.5 million. And another $1.5 million in proposed new revenue to subsidize program funds. So for example, take the County Planning Commission. They receive a general fund subsidy. In fact, most of the revenue the Planning Commission receives is by way of general fund support. So we had a recommendation that Planning Commission look for additional revenue to offset that general fund contribution. So that would be an example of new revenue. And I think for the Planning Commission in particular, we had recommended they identify an additional $125,000 in revenue for charges or services they provide, and that has a direct offset on the amount of general fund support has to be provided to that agency. So we identified about $1.5 million of those types of recommendations. So to relieve the general fund of subsidizing other programs, we identified about $1.5 million. And that's in the other uses line of our roll report or our subsidy report. That's where you see those impacts. So again, areas targeted for reductions in general fund. We looked at vacant positions. We looked at jail operations, contractual services, and building maintenance costs, knowing that there are a lot of changes underway for how the county deploys itself into space, less owned space. We have a new leased headquarters going online next year. So we have changes related to that reduction in the amount of county-owned space incorporated into those targeted reductions. Levy fund, as we talked about yesterday in the committee meeting, we know we have we hope is a temporary assumption of no growth in levy fund revenue. We have to wait for an outcome to an election in a few weeks, but we wanted to submit a recommended budget that took that into account. So the budget development process for Health and Human Services, which receive a significant amount of local funding through the levies, we had to craft a recommended budget for the levy fund that was balanced within the resources in the levy fund itself, current revenue, but also cash resources available within the public assistance fund. In the chart right in the middle of the slide just gives you a synopsis, a basic snapshot of how did we combine those three things. Targeted reductions to program expenditures, so that's on the program side. Contribution of cash resources from the public assistance fund, which we've been doing since last year or the year before. So bolstering what's available to support critical programs using those resources, and then also using levy fund reserves in both years. And you can see, we look at the reductions, 5.7 million in 14 recommended, 10.3 million of reductions on the program side recommended in 15. Again, if the levy does pass, we have some opportunities to decide, of these cuts, do we want to restore them one for one? Should there be reallocation of resources to priorities and effective programs? So once we know the outcome of that election, this targeted reduction amount that's been recommended is going to become outdated. PA fund contribution, we're using about 7 million in 14 and 13 million in 15. The idea is we have cash resources sitting in this fund. They're shared with the levy fund, and the goal or the objective is to maximize those resources over this 2-year period and to lessen the amount of cuts we have to make, knowing that there is a levy on the ballot and we'll have an election outcome in a few weeks. And then also a draw on levy reserves in both years, 8 million in 14, and then it lessens in 15 because of the increase in PA fund contribution and reductions. The idea is we're trying to maintain critical programs, use PA cash, but also make sure that the budgeted reserve in the levy fund does not fall below that 10%. So in the end, on top of all those high-level priorities and objectives, we're also targeting that 10% reserve policy, which we've done in the recommended budget for 14 and 15. So the types of areas that we looked at when we provided options, I know yesterday we had a discussion on, well, what was the total of the reductions? The total reductions are there in this table. We had other recommendations, we had other options, but this is the combination we're electing to use for the recommended budget for the next biennium. We're looking at areas, vacant positions that do not involve direct service staff. We're looking more at administrative and management positions when it comes to reducing funding for vacant positions. And I'll say that again, that's not for direct service staff. As you see the roll reports and look at the numbers, we have vacancies still budgeted in the big four of Health and Human Services. Low priority programs that are smaller nature or contracts, and also reorganization. There's some areas where we're looking at reorganizing some of the programmatic areas within Health and Human Services to garner some recommended savings. And again, this information is detailed in the departmental summary for the corresponding department within the budget plan itself, or the budget document itself. Here's our high-level table that we've seen before. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but you can see for general fund, over on the left column, we have slight operating surplus in both 14 and 15 based on the recommended budget that we're presenting. Levy fund, we're at the 10%. So these numbers factor in everything. This is all three steps: the initial starting point, the refinement process, base adjustment process, which is step 2, and then step 3, where we make recommendations for targeted reductions or changes to the budget. When you factor everything in, what the recommended 2-year spending plan or operating plan of the county is, that's the summary of results right here on this chart, which we actually are already seen. It's interesting to note for general fund, a reduction in a budget of $12.5 million. So we can look at the current budget for 2013 for general fund and compare it to the recommended budget for general fund for 14. It's a reduction in $12.5 million. The recommended budget of $165 million for executive agencies is 7.2% lower compared to the current budget. So we're flat or declining when it comes to general fund budgets. Again, I'll hit on the same point. The prospect of additional revenue from the proposed replacement of the smaller levy is not incorporated in these numbers. Everything assumes flat funding at this point in time. All right, so every budget presentation needs pie charts, so we'll do some pie charts. The first one you have is all funds revenue. So this is all the operating revenue that we expect to incorporate into the next biennium for operating budgets only. And the charts are helpful because the numbers at the bottom give you some trend. You can compare years, 12, 13, 14, and 15. You can see at the bottom of the chart, bottom right, revenue's flat on an all funds basis, a slight, less than 0.5% decline. So we see stable revenue. This includes all the things we talked about when it comes to general fund or in these numbers. This is everything, general fund and special revenue funds combined. So fairly stable outlook. The big hit we took, of course, was property tax. Drop in assessed valuation and loss of state property tax reimbursements. But you can see in 2012, I'm still in the numbers section of this pie chart, $341 million for property tax, and now we're down to $313 million in 14. So pretty significant drop. If you look at the pie itself, the pie chart itself is helpful because it gives you an idea of composition. County gets a lot of revenue, $1.26 billion expected next year. What's it made out of? And you can see the two biggest wedges, property tax, 24.7%, and intergovernmental revenue or transfer payments of over 26%. So that's interesting. When you think about general fund, we don't talk so much about property tax, and we don't talk so much about intergovernmental revenue. It's more sales tax. It's more charges for services. You can see when we look at the county globally, we're factoring in things we do on behalf of the state and federal government, and then property tax is used to provide local funding. That pie chart looks much different. And the other interesting relationship, at least I think, is that intergovernmental revenue in most cases represents a transfer of revenue from the state or federal government for the county to do something locally. So the more that wedge shrinks, and we're still doing the same thing, we're still mandated to do the same thing, generally speaking, not all the time, that property tax wedge is supposed to fill in the gap, those local dollars. So when you think about health and human services, if we have less in the way of reimbursements from the state, less federal reimbursement revenue, but we still have the same need at the local level, ideally it'd be nice if property tax steps in and fills that gap. Going back to my first point, property tax has dropped by a significant amount since 2012, and that number is considered to be flat in this budget. So about $29 million drop since 2012. So that can place a stress on a county or local government when we're talking about how does policy at a different level of government affect local implementation of something that's very important. General fund revenue. Giving this to you just as in a table format, we talked about the decrease in local government fund. We were cut again for 2014. So on top of the 50% phase out that was part of the 13 and 14 budget, we saw another $600,000 or $700,000 drop into 14 based on changes at tax policy at the state level. Property taxes will be flat this year. Then remember, starting at 15, we will shift property tax revenue from the unvoted millage to help service ongoing debt service. We're not taking on additional debt in 14 or 15. We've been using cash in the debt service fund, and now we're going to make that shift in 2015. Sales tax, again, looking healthy. It's been the performer of the revenue for general fund for the past 3 years. We're looking at, just in 13, it appears we could be a 3.7% increase. Our local economic research analyst, George Zeller, just sent out his monthly email. The inflation-adjusted collection for this month went back up. So we were seeing some small declines when you factor in inflation, but the October numbers say something else. They're starting to bounce back up a little bit, which is good. So on a nominal or cash basis, we could see a 3.7% increase. Even when you factor in inflation, we're still seeing increases that are 2.6, 2.7. And now with the prospect of Medicaid expansion occurring in the state of Ohio, that will only help these sales tax numbers because a portion of Medicaid expenses related to manage Medicaid care organizations is in the sales tax base. That's something that was added in 2010. In hindsight, it was a good idea, I guess, especially if we're going to see expansion of Medicaid in the state. Investment earnings are low. They're as low as they've ever been. I've been here 13 years. They've never been this low. It is 100% a function of market conditions. It's not a decrease of investable balances. or some lack of performance by the county. It is all related to this reduction in short-term rates attributable to the financial crisis that began in 2008. So as the private sector continues to have a robust recovery, including equities markets, counties and cities that have to invest in boring fixed assets are stuck with really, really low rates for investment. Not much we can do. We do expect to see a turnaround in 15 and into 16. So for example, if we're looking at that investment earnings line in this table, we have, take 2015 for example, 4.7 million, a slight recovery from 14, and then just over 5 million in 16. Those are best estimates for right now. Traditionally, if we've looked at what happens to investment income when rates go down, and then what happens to investment income for the county when rates start to go back up, we generally have a more rapid recovery in investment earnings. In the past 2 cycles, after 2 years, investment earnings bounce right back up to the prior or historical average. That's not happening here. And we're now into our 4th year of serious decline as things get reinvested from the portfolio. We're stuck at those lower rates. So there's not much we can do. If anything, any good piece of news, I think it's a safe assumption that 15, 16 could rebound faster than what we're expecting. But for right now, we're going to be conservative and show smaller incremental increases in investment earnings. If we see short-term rates start to inch up faster than expected, that number in 15 and 16 will be higher than what we're showing now. And keep in mind, we peaked in 2006 at $30 million in investment income. So it's a market difference. Let's move on to expenditures. Back to a pie chart.
We really need to let him finish, and we're going to ask questions when he's done. So please write them down, and we'll be starting with Julie and go right down the row. Please continue.
Okay. So expenditures by function. The numbers at the bottom of the pie chart, those tie directly to that summary slide we saw earlier. Now, we're focusing on composition. How are we spending our dollars programmatically in this biennial budget, this recommended budget? You can see first off the 14 and 15 recommended appropriation levels are fairly stable, 1.28 billion in both years. Go back to the pie chart, talk about composition. How are we deploying resources? 44% of the county's all-fund budget is used for social services and health and safety rather. So 44% of what we do is related to health and human services. So the social services piece of the pie and the health and safety piece of the pie that's right next to it in blue. That's not just what we're spending out of the levy. That's what we're spending in total from those operating programs. The levy provides support for those programs. So for example, if I go back down to the data of this table, social services, it's $480 million recommended for 2014. Of that $480 million of resources we're deploying, a good portion, a little less than half, is coming from the voted health and human services levies. Public safety and justice are also a fairly significant piece of what we do on an all funds basis here at the county, 23, almost 24%. So almost a quarter of this all funds budget is related to justice, the administration of justice, not just the jail, the courts, the prosecutor, everything related to the justice system. Government operating expenditures are about 1.2 million lower. That's general government. A lot of the basic things we do, the administrative function, we're keeping that in check. We're holding that to 2013 levels, actually reducing it even more when you factor in those target reductions. Okay, the next pie chart is the same all funds budget, but instead of dividing it up by function or programmatic area, this gives you an idea of how we are spending the money internally. What is the expenditure category or object? So not the programmatic category, but how are we using the dollars to accomplish the stuff on this pie chart? That's what this pie chart is explaining. So the basic expenditure categories you would expect to see. Fringe benefits and salary combined, over 40% of the county all funds budget is on people that are tasked with accomplishing the day-to-day operations of the county, interacting with the public and providing services both externally and internally to the county. The budget, the recommended budget, has just over 35% of the resources for contracts and service provider agreements. So we talked about when it comes to base development, we spend a lot of time working with agencies on what they may call a contract list or a group of service providers when it comes to health and human services. As you can see, we're accomplishing more than a third of what we do. What resources we deploy are done through contracts or agreements with outside groups or outside companies. 4.5% of the county budget is for internal services. So these are things that keep the county physical plant, IT services, administrative services, about 4.5%. So it's a very loose approximation of the county's administrative overhead. If you factor in some other things, it's probably closer to 5 or 6%, but still well below a 10% benchmark for operating overhead reflected in the all funds budget. Talk a little bit about ending balances in our two major funding sources, general fund and health and human services levy fund. For general fund, top line news is that the budget is balanced. Result of operations in both 14, 15, and 16 actually have operating surpluses. You can see it bounces up in 2016. Part of that's related to the trend in revenue and stable or non-increasing operating expenses. We have, even after you factor in reserves on balance for general fund, 2014 recommended budget has a balance to expenditures of over 30%. 15 is 27%, and we're still at 25, and that's factoring in those reserves that, again, in most cases are not spent. They're reserves held against the balance. In the Health and Human Services Levy Fund, as we talked about earlier, we're using a combination of targeted reductions in both 14 and 15. We're using public assistance dollars, which I'll come to in the next slide, and also drawing on some of that levy reserve to get us through the 14 and 15 biennium. Again, that's assuming no new revenue, but we wanted to be able to present a recommended budget for the next 2 years that shows we can accomplish balancing all the resources and critical mandated things and things that are very important to the county when it comes to health and human services, that we can accomplish that with that assumption of no new revenue. Again, we know we still have a few weeks before the outcome of the levy. And we hold the balance at the required policy limit of 10% in all 3 years, using that strategy, those three balancing components that I mentioned earlier. Talk about the levy fund briefly. I have the bar charts, it's in black and white on your printout, but it looks nice in color on the overhead. This is a history of levy fund revenue. So the property tax revenue collected into the levy fund for both levies. Just have a basic chart starting in 2004 all the way through this year. And you can see the high point, the high watermark was 2009. So that was after, or actually that was right before a 3-year appraisal. So assessed valuation was probably at its highest point on a nominal basis in 2009. And collection trends were probably in the 96.5%, 97% range, so fairly good historically. And you can see what that results in. All those factors come together along with the absence of any reductions in state property tax reimbursements. You come in at over $243 million for that high watermark year of 2009. Now fast forward to 2013 or 2014, we're anticipating about $203 million in levy fund revenue. So if you jump ahead 4 years, you factor in the drop in assessed valuation, and the drop we had just from this past appraisal cycle was 7.2%. Factor in the reduction of state reimbursements related to voted property tax levies, and you can see a significant drop. 243 to 203, 40 million. It's a lot. And that's had an impact. The county's had to navigate this loss of revenue. It's through no fault of the county's, not much control we have over it, but nonetheless, the county, whether it's looking at the straight numbers or we're looking at the high-level policy or the high-level priorities of what we want to do, this trend right here is something that has been in the forefront of county decision makers for some time now. And it just happened over the past few years, really became more acute with some of those changes I mentioned. Passage of the 3.9 mil levy, it will increase total levy revenue by about 20, we'll call it 27 million for a nice round number. So it gets us closer to 230 million, still be 5% off of that peak year of 2009. So even with the replacement levy, we're still going to be below that peak year based on everything we know right now. Levy fund and the balance with public assistance fund cash resources. You've seen this table before. We always carry it in our quarterly reports. We carry it in our budget documents. And the top section of the chart just gives you the operations for the levy fund, the money coming in. So for example, if we look at the 2014 recommended budget, 203.3 million revenue, and we've identified utilization of 211.6. That 211.6, this is important, that's net of those targeted reductions I mentioned earlier. It's also net of the offset from public assistance fund cash resources. So after we factor those in, it's 211.5 million of resources. The rest of the lines just give you an idea of how much funding is available. So if we add up what we're deploying out of the levy fund and the PA offset, about 218, just shy of 219 million available for health and human service programs. We know we have we're drawing on levy reserve all 3 years of the recommended budget. We're still balancing to the policy limit. The balance will be just over 20 million for all 3 years. And we've also added, the last 2 lines give you an idea. We've talked about the public assistance fund balance, the cash that we're using in concert with levy dollars. How does that look? Well, it starts off at 43. It's actually a little higher at the end of 2012. And it starts winding down because we want to use those resources, knowing that things could change when it comes to revenue. The objective of the levy fund budget was to maximize utilization of these resources. They're there to be spent. It's not a reserve we want to hold on to in totality. So we show a steady utilization of the PA resources. And then just to give you an idea, since really the money in the PA fund is being used for the same purposes as the levy fund dollars, if you look at the combined balance to expenditure rate, the last line of that table, we're actually higher than 10% in 14, 15, and 16. When you factor in that level of cash available to us for these purposes I mentioned, we're at over 20% in 14 and 15% in 15. Talk about trends. The high point for the PA fund balance was 49.3 million. That was back in 2010. And much of that buildup comes from that 2009, 2010, 2011 period. The state actually had leftover residual dollars in areas such as TANF and some other funding sources. And generally the larger counties receive those windfalls because they have larger populations of clients to serve. So what you saw was a buildup in 10 and 11 in particular of those resources. Now, we're using them to help us get through this period of declining revenue. We have other options that will be available to us if the levy passes, but I want to give you an idea, just high level, of what's in the PA fund. I know it's been an ongoing discussion, but I think this table kind of wraps up the whole interplay between levy dollars and PA offset and what that means. Hopefully that's something that you can turn back to when we have discussions going into the next set of budget hearings. And that's the last chart I have, so I have questions. If I could real quick, just want to acknowledge the OBM staff, if there are any left in the room. There's a few, there's more back in the office. That's a wonderful group of people. Contrary to popular belief, we do not run a number sweatshop. We actually try to focus a lot more on the programmatic stuff, the high level stuff, take a lot of pride in our work product. We're very glad we're able to get a book out for this hearing, so you have it in front of you, not just for this presentation, but for the rest of the hearings going forward. But it's a great group of people. They have a considerable amount of care for what the county does, so I wanted to mention them.
Thank you very much, Director, for a very extensive presentation. And I know it's difficult to hold questions till the end, and I appreciate people doing that. We just don't have enough time scheduled for a totally leisurely discussion, so we got to kind of move it along. So I appreciate that, and we have about 45 minutes for questions today, and if more is needed, we'll continue on Thursday. And we're going to start to my left, 3 questions per round with Councilman Rogers.
I just have 2 questions for at least this round. And the first is on page 9, and I think both of these questions are just for clarity. Page 9 under property tax, there's a 341 million starting in 2012.
Yes.
And then, but on the next page, the property taxes are 14.8 million.
Yes, on page 10, that's general fund only. So that is the amount that was from the, let me go back up. Page 9 is property taxes collected for all the voted levies, so HHS, BUDD, we had some voted jail debt, and also the unvoted stuff. So we're collecting about 35, 36 million unvoted millage. If you jump down to the next page, page 10, that 14 million you're referencing, Councilman, is the general fund portion only of total property taxes collected by the county. So with that 341, we only had 14 million available for general operations.
And then the difference between client services and contracts?
It's more of a subtlety in how we classify contractual expenditures. They're both for contracts and agreements. What we like to do when it comes to service provider contracts and things that are more germane to helping people when it comes to health and human services. So for example, boarding care of children in foster, purchase and congregate care, we classify those as client services. It's still a contract, but that term is, that category rather, is used mainly in the health and human services area for their contracts.
Okay.
So the contracts category is more for consulting, for any type of legal work, for supplies, for maintenance, a lot of the ongoing stuff.
Great, thank you.
Councilman Jones.
My question is on the Public Assistant Fund. Each year, and help me to read, and I'm on page 15, the public assistance balance for this year. Am I reading this correctly? There's $31 million in the PA fund?
It's the 2013 budget would assume an ending balance in the PA fund of 31 million. Now we're projecting, if you go to the next column, 2013 estimate, right now based on our current projection, we believe that public assistance fund, after the offset that we're providing to Health and Human Services levy fund, would come in at just over 32 million. And you can see it'll steadily decline as we use more and more of those resources. It declines to 25 to 12 to 6. And based on the recommended budget we're presenting today, that's going to change if the levy passes. There's going to be a change in how we utilize those funds, most likely.
So let me give that back to you. In 2013, we will use $12 million from the PA, for the PA fund.
Well, if you go right to the middle of the table, we're going to use just under 10 million. So that middle line where it says, I'm sorry, yes, 10.7 million. 12 million is budgeted.
Okay.
10.7 million is what we're estimating.
Estimating.
So at the beginning of the year, we had said, hey, we think we'll need 12. The way it looks, the way things are shaping up for 13, and we're almost done with 13, we think it's going to be lower, about 10.7.
And the 32.3 represents
What's left?
what is left.
Yes.
And as you speculate with on what's left each year, I assume you're speculating how much might actually be put into the fund?
That's what we're recommending to use from the PA fund to help offset utilization of levy dollars. So we're making a recommendation in all, 2 years of the biennium plus 2016 to utilize PAA cash in tandem with levy resources to fund health and human services.
Yeah. And for clarification, the PA fund dollars are dollars from the department's budgets that are not used.
Correct. They're dollars mainly from reimbursement that come into the program funds or the operating funds that generally support a majority of the larger programs. So whatever is not spent that's sitting in that balance can be used to help offset the need for levy dollars. So for health and human services, it's either coming from another government, state or federal, or it's coming from local health and human services. So if there are less, sometimes you hear the term transfer payments or intergovernmental revenue. If there's less intergovernmental revenue for a particular program in health and human services, you either use local dollars, find some other source, or you do less of something. So that's the choice we're left with. So we've seen some drop off in that intergovernmental revenue category, as we saw in that pie chart. We've seen a drop off in available levy dollars. So that's where the challenge has been for the county. Either find new levy dollars or change the way we're using our available resources right now.
And the PA fund is not a reserve fund.
It's cash. It's cash sitting in a separate operating fund. We use fund accounting, so we have to keep it separate. But it's a cash. It's not meant to be a reserve.
Thank you.
Okay. Councilwoman Conwell.
Through the chair to the director, page 7, I just have 2 questions, the first round. So in the area that you said, areas targeted for reductions include vacant positions and low-priority programs. What constitutes a low-priority program?
When we first look at our spectrum of priorities, low, medium, high, and in the county's budget and financial policy, we're using those guidelines to look at budgetary and programmatic priorities. So it doesn't mean that something doesn't have value or isn't something worthy of being done, but when we have limited dollars, we use those low, medium, high priorities to help guide our decision support. So for an example, something that's mandated, it's going to have a high priority. If it's something that protects children, vulnerable children, it's going to have a high priority. So that's how we use those terms.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to know, the programs that you're considering low-priority programs, which would mean that they would be close to being cut. So homeless services, I believe, are not mandated to have that. So that would be considered a low-priority program?
Well, it depends on what piece of the organization. I think right now I'm just looking at this list of recommended reductions. In homeless services, they have a small, actually $100,000 reduction. It's related to North Point Transitional Housing, and that's in 2014. So that's something you look at. What are the contracts? What are the types of things that an agency such as Homeless Services is doing? Of those things they're doing, what are the most important, and what do we think we could transition out of, either find a different provider that's not the county or a different source of funding? So that's an example.
Second question, since inception of the new government in 2012, there was a discussion regarding the need for reorganization for efficiencies. So you have reorganization. What is considered left to be reorganized?
The one item that we're considering or have recommended is Family and Children First Council. Here's an example of talking about priorities. We have a mandate to provide that coordination effort by Family and Children First. Right now, it's a standalone agency. The recommended biennial budget has the mandated function of Family and Children First Council being folded into the Department of Children and Family Services.
So they're going to reorganize it, not get rid of it?
That'd be considered reorganization. So rather than operating as an independent, or not independent, but as a separate operational budget, the mandated function would fall back into or be folded into DCFS. The other stuff that we're doing on top of the mandated function would be phased out in this recommended budget.
So for these areas targeted for reductions that are listed, is there any way to make sure council has all the programs that are decided to be?
In the budget plan, we've described those cuts.
In
So if
this
you-
book?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right.
So when you go to, I don't know, maybe after we're done with questions, I can do an illustration where you can find information. We can maybe walk through one particular agency just so you can see where the information is, but it's all been documented department by department in the book.
Is it highlighted or anything?
Yes,
Okay.
it's in a separate section.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we will move to Councilman Schron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reno, you've been doing this, what, 5, 6, 7 years? How many years?
I've been director, it's my 4th year.
4th year?
Yes.
Okay. On page 10, you talk about investment earnings having dropped from 12 to 6 to 3.
Yeah.
And then you have this optimistic statement at the bottom of the page. I'm not sure I share quite the optimism that interest rates are going to go up because where we are. Do you have an expectation, being in your position for 4 years plus, about risks desired for these investments?
Well, I'm a lowly budget director.
I understand that, but that's why I'm only asking you.
Here,
I'm not.
I think there are things we can do within the confines of the investment policy. We can do things differently, and I know those are being looked at by the current investment officer and the current treasurer. I think because of the way short-term rates are now, you're limited to how much benefit you could actually draw, how much yield you could scoop from making changes within the policy. So I think really what's going to help that line item in general fund revenue is going to be rates going up. We can do a lot. We can try different programs. we can shift some of the portfolio to different types of holdings. But in order to maintain preservation of principal being the key thing, you're not going to see more than my layman's estimate, maybe a 5 or 10% increase based on making some changes in portfolio strategy, because we're so, not inflexible, but it's a very consistent and conservative strategy that we have to employ, even with changes within the different types of investments. So I've kept what I think is a very, talk to the investment officer, which I know he's giving us a conservative look at next year in 15. If rates do push up, though, just based on what's happened to how the portfolio behaves when rates go up, we'll see, we should see better returns than what we're seeing right now. But again, that's on how long will this low rate environment persist. We don't know. We thought maybe 2 years would be long enough. Now we're into 3 and 4 years. So hopefully it's not a decade of.
So we should not be, in your opinion, at least as budget director,
Yes.
expect we're going to close that $6 million gap that we had from high to where we currently are.
Based on what we know now, no, I don't think so.
Okay, so we should not be looking for funds from there. Buying debt. Any thoughts in regards to that? It's still within the same category.
Buying.
Other debts from
like-
other organizations in order to improve that ratio.
I think I'd leave it up to the investment officer within the policy and how they feel about it.
No, that's okay. I understand
We've always
that.
taken a
My
conservative
job is
approach.
to try and
No, I
ask
don't-
you as constructing the budget, and,
So you're talking about the municipal infrastructure
Yeah,
that we're recommending?
yeah.
Okay, so that one, right now on the investments, given the conservative portfolio that we invest in, typically the rates have been below 1%. So when we purchase those assets or invest in those, we're looking at a higher return than 1%. So we would think that would be a positive to our investment strategy.
Okay, if you're going to speak to this issue, then what is your forecast as to what it's going to do, Acting Director?
On
This
overall,
particular line item that we're opening up on this investments. It was 12 million, we're now yielding 3.5. And where is the, are we going to look at closing this gap by changing policy? Because obviously, the next question is, actually the opening question was the risk exposure. So I want to come back and circle back to this $6-7 million that we're talking about here, which covers a
okay,
lot of
we did consider increased returns from that program, and that because there's only 10% of the portfolio that's available for that, it won't have a large impact on the overall investment strategy, but it will have upward trend, which is in the numbers that were projected.
Give me your projection, because we're here to try to build a budget, and in response to listening to the input, this body is going to be faced at some point potentially with reviewing risk exposure of our portfolio, increasing above 10%, and higher yields as a result of that risk exposure. And so all we want to do is have some kind of input for this body as to whether we can close $6, $7, $8 million gap by taking on some additional risk, and what will that yield be in your best guess?
From the best guess, again, it would be at this point between that 1% and 2%.
Okay, not much of a gain then, based on that. Okay, thank you. Page,
If I could just,
yeah, that's okay.
I agree with your
That was
point,
only
Councilman.
question two. Yeah.
With the municipal program, though, there's also a benefit to be received by the municipality. So it's not, the return piece is a good benefit for the county, but we're providing an outlet or a source of financing, even though it's short-term, 5 years, to municipalities. So they're getting through that credit evaluation process easier. We're providing them the ability to get a transaction done that gives them access to capital. So if we can benefit a little bit through some increased yield, that's great, but I don't think we should lose sight that the idea of the program is regional in nature also, that we can help them access something they don't necessarily
I understand
have.
there's a philosophical presentation, but this body has a responsibility to the county for the fiscal
Yes.
side.
Sure.
Not necessarily to the philosophical side that maybe might be out there also, so.
I agree.
On page 12, the primary drivers of our budget are salary and fringe benefits. I mean, of the, not 50%, but we're sitting at 40 plus. The fringe benefit line, is that directly related dollar for dollar to the salary line, or are there fixed items within the benefit line, irrespective of whether or not salary goes up or down? For example, pensions and things of that nature that we're locked into that are not movable on that 12 percentage points.
There's a few when I talk about fringe benefits. Let's talk hospitalization first. That's part of that fringe benefit cost category. that rate doesn't change, that rate does not change based on salary. So if someone's making $30,000 a year or $60,000 a year, their healthcare, the county's contribution to their healthcare cost does not change. Now, PRS and Medicare, that's tied directly to percentage of earnings. So the more people we employ or the higher average salaries are, the higher the county's contribution to PRS and Medicare would be. So it's different than the hospitalization piece of fringe benefits. The other component that we throw into that line is workers' compensation charges. The county is self-insured for workers' compensation, and each year we are assessing a charge to operating funds. That's not based on the number of people or how much they made. It's an actuarial analysis of workers' compensation claims. So in a sense, that number is fixed in a way, even though it changes from year to year. It's not tied directly to the number of people or how much they're making. It's tied to some other factors. So those are the big four components within that fringe benefit line.
Could we get fringe benefits broken out then
Sure.
as to healthcare piece
Yes.
and workers' comp piece? And because those are directly correlated to what kind of healthcare benefits we choose to offer, even though they're flat right now, I think you indicated.
Okay, we can provide that. And
Thank you.
when I talk hospitalization, just to follow up, the hospitalization expense that we're carrying in these numbers is the employer portion. So the portion that impacts the operating budget or agency that person works for. The employee is also picking up a portion of that cost.
That was my.
Okay. Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, I'm going to ask my questions for today offline and move to Councilman Gallagher.
On the local government fund reductions, while I understood at the time for the rationale of bringing those down to plug the deficits
Yes.
in Columbus, now that we have a substantial surplus, well over $1 billion, would it not behoove us to remind the state that this would be a good time to at least look at returning some of those dollars, if only on potentially the social services side that have greatly affected the least of us?
Councilman, that's a good point. And in my mind, I thought the General Assembly and the governor were reminded this past budget cycle. I know not just this county, but other counties, just hearing a lot of the chatter online and people that work in local government, that they thought for sure that maybe there'd be some movement in those reductions, that 50% reduction in the local government fund. I mean, for the county, we were able to weather that change. I mean, it's a significant loss to the county. $17 million is a large amount, even for a general fund budget that's $370+ million. But we were able, again, through budget flexibility, proactive financial management, and decision-making for the county as a whole, the institution, not just the people that had their hands in the numbers, but for the institution as a whole, to cope with that. There definitely was lobbying efforts from all parts of the state, from all political stripes, from all levels of local government to do something to help restore that reduction. It did not take place. I don't think there was support anywhere, I think, within the policy making areas of state government for, I guess, a variety of reasons. And if you can imagine, if even a portion of that was restored, how much that would help this county, how much it would help cities, other local governments. It's amazing. 17 million is a lot for any government. It's obviously more for a smaller government. So factor in the 50% loss, the changes in tax policy that were enacted as part of the current biennial budget did reduce that allocation an additional 4%. So that we actually went backwards from where we thought we would go. I think there was some optimism that maybe there'd be some restoration, just a partial restoration of that reduction, of that clawback of local government fund dollars. There was not. There's actually, I think, the undivided fund fell victim to tax policy changes, and I'm not sure if there was much thought, again, this is my opinion, much thought into what those impacts would be to the local government fund at the state and how that would impact local governments, because now it was, again, communicated in a hurried fashion a month or two after the budget went into effect. So that's where we're with it. We understand it. We factor in the numbers. We're dealing with it, and we'll continue to deal with that factor that we've accepted as permanent for the time being.
And maybe that's something that the council needs to look at doing, because I did ask my state representative that very question, and he was actually kind of shocked and said, no, we have no intention.
It's not shocking to me to hear that.
Well, and I know, as people looked at us with cocked eyes, I now start to look at other government,
Yes.
the larger governments.
Yes.
With my own cocked eye as to what's going on here. And even if, again, if it were just to return funds that have drastically reduced our ability to help those in the least positions in society.
Sure.
Maybe it's something we should look at. Thank you.
Welcome.
Councilman Germana.
Thank you, Mr.
Councilman
Chairman.
Germana.
This is kind of like a high-level view of all these numbers. I see we have stability pretty much with the revenues
Yeah, I
and
think so.
and expense.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if we ever take into consideration the trends in population. Are you ever looking at what the population in Cuyahoga County is, and as far as the ratio spending per capita? And I'm not sure if you could answer that now, but I'd be interested in knowing how these relate per capita.
Councilman, we look more at high level. Population's important, but I think it's hard to gauge what sales tax would do based just on population. We've had some declining population in the past 10 years. But as you can see, after the recession has started, well, recession's gone, and now we're having a slow recovery. Sales tax is looking stable. It's looking actually fairly good growth over the past few years, even with population pretty much flat or plateaued. We're looking at local economic factors. Employment rate's important. The churn or things that are going on in the region, whether it's construction or business opportunities, those are important. Now, we're not equipped in our office necessarily to take a look at a collection of economic indicators, plug it into a model, and come out with a number. We look at all those things, we evaluate them, but we also, even more importantly, we look at the trends in the actual collection data we're getting. And it's not broken out by category. The state does not provide you sales tax by different industry sectors. It comes in administrative categories. They do break out the automotive, so that can be helpful. So you have to use the data that you get on a monthly basis, be a fan or a reader of outside information on the economy and what's going on. A lot of the reporting we get from local research analysts helps. And what you can really do is temper your estimates. You have to put all that together, and as an office, as a director, make a good faith effort to estimate what we can expect. And that expectation is communicated through the number, but it also has to be something that's believable. We shouldn't be inflating the numbers just to help us structurally balance a budget. We want to make sure we're being conservative, but not too conservative. I think that's what we've done here. And we're showing growth, but we're actually lowering the level of growth in 14 compared to 13. Hopefully we're wrong. I think Medicaid expansion is going to play a part, and it may push that number up. So those are types of things we look at. And reevaluate and update that trend every quarter so you have most up-to-date information. And it tends to work because when you look at our second quarter and third quarter estimates, we're generally within 0.5% accuracy for sales tax. And that's important because you need that information because it plays a big role in the high-level piece of the budget you're looking at as decision makers.
Councilman Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a few questions yesterday, and in the interest of time and the number of members of the body here, I'm not going to ask more questions, but I do want to say that both the presentation yesterday and this overview today have been, I think, very well put together and not that difficult to understand, which is an amazing thing. It may be partly just through the osmosis of the last 3 years, but
Could be.
But it's a very reasonable, I think, budget considering the sort of awkward time frame we're in here with the levy just 2 weeks away, and in particular the willingness, on a policy level, the willingness to spend down from the public assistance fund because of the situation that we find ourselves in if the levy was not passed is 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 certainly something that caught my attention.
Okay.
So now we're not down so far down in the weeds as to say, okay, this is a budget that would be just fine with me, but I have no interest in debating what a large part of what is unknown.
Sure.
So I don't have any more questions for today, except that I do think that the presentation yesterday and the overview today are very well done and very clear.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would kind of reiterate what Mr. Brady says, that this is a very comprehensive document. There's a lot of information here, and I'd like to spend some more time with it and drill down on it and probably have some more questions. But at this point, in the interest of time, I'm going to refer to Mr. Greenspan, who I'm sure has a lot more questions.
Councilman Greenspan.
I have no question. Being respectful. So I'm assuming since we go down this way, it's 3, and then when we start over, I get 3 more, so I have 6.
See, I told you you'd ask for 6.
I was hearing that, but actually, when you get done, then I'll ask who all has additional questions.
There is a meeting at 5 o'clock.
That's fine. I won't. Yeah, that's not a problem. I have questions that will go far beyond today, so I'll be respectful of the rules that the chair has outlined. Starting on page 3, just understanding some of the fundamental assumptions, and looking at the second bullet point, we talk about salaries and benefits are based on current levels, projected for 2014, held flat for non-bargaining. So, what I'm assuming that you're taking the 2013 numbers, moving them to 2014, and then being respectful of the bargaining units and their increases that have been approved.
That's correct, with one minor change. We're actually looking at what we've projected for 14. So it's second quarter projection for 14, our estimate for 14, we're using that as our starting point.
Okay.
And that's because we've captured in any of the movement, whether it's vacancies, whether we're assuming an attrition rate, we factored that into our analysis we did for second quarter. We can then bring that over and use that as a starting point. And then we jump to step 2, which is that refinement process I talked about, where we work with agencies to make sure we're capturing their approved level of staffing. And we are mindful of if there's a contract in place, we have that growth rate factored in also.
That's baked in.
Yes.
But for the existing, so that's for all the existing employees. I understand you're working with the fringes, the attrition and the rehires
Yes.
and the vacancies and so forth. But what caught my eye was the next statement regarding the non-bargaining units. So because the bargaining units have contractual increases, the non-bargaining obviously do not. So is the interpretation here that for this budget, for 14 and 15, that the non-bargaining units will not see a salary increase?
The recommended 14-15 budget does not provide for an increase for non-bargaining. Doesn't mean that in early 14, an evaluation wouldn't be done to determine if we could support making an adjustment for non-bargaining employees. I've been here a while, maybe going back to the 2000, 2001, 2003 time period, many of the recommended budgets already had cost of living built in for non-bargaining. We started getting away from that practice probably in the mid-2000s when we had downturn in the local economy. So this has actually become more commonplace where we have growth built in for approved union contracts. We leave non-bargaining flat and then do an evaluation early on in the next year to see what we could support for non-bargaining. And that'll happen again.
So from 2008, 2007, up until this year, when non-bargaining employees did not receive a pay
Correct.
increase.
Non-bargaining did not receive cost of living from
What year did that start? Or stop? What was it? Before the 2013 increase, when was the last one?
The last increase, I think, was 2007.
And then in 2013, the increase was 1%?
It was 1% for executive agency staff.
Okay, all right.
Now, there are other non-bargaining employees not under the county executive that are granted cost of living, but that's outside of the purview of the executive. So
Okay.
in some other areas, elected officials in particular, they have discretion within their appropriate levels to grant cost of living increases for non-bargaining, but we're not carrying those assumptions in our recommended numbers to you.
So no salary increases for non-bargaining?
Correct.
Okay. In the fourth bullet point, the 2% inflationary factor parameter, you kind of touched on, it was not applied to most budgets for operating and service contracts and other expenditures. How, I guess what my question is regarding, once again, if there are contracts in place, you're honoring those commitments in those contracts. The estimate of 2% are for those contracts that come up during this contract period?
Exactly. We want to factor in some growth. So we start with this global application of 2%. Then we jump to step 2, which is that refinement process. Now the analysts have to go back and take a look at, do I want that 2% in this particular line? Do I need it for this contract? Maybe it's 3%. So they have to use some judgment analysis to decide where to change the 2% that was applied globally. So it's again, that's the human intervention piece. It's a lot of review. This is how we start. This is the best way to actually create budget data that we can then work with and review and report on, but it does change.
Did you assume in any of your models for contracts that were coming up no 2%, or was 2% the minimum?
2% was probably the minimum.
Okay. And then my last kind of subject matter question, I'm using that as 3, on the next line item, budget lines for service contracts and overhead were held flat at 2013 estimated levels. I'm once again assuming that we had no contracts that had escalators in it. How did you contemplate, and is this where you contemplated this temporary move, permanent move scenario under overhead and service contracts?
It's both. The service contracts, that probably should read service provider contracts. So in the area of health and human services, we're looking at utilization of those contracts.
Okay.
That missing word actually would make more sense.
So
and then overhead would be things that are, well, it wouldn't be utilities, but things that are, I don't have an example off the top of my head, but it would be the more basic, smaller, less expansive contracts. And also looking at, when I think of overhead, now that we've consolidated IT, a lot of those contracts for maintenance and other things that fall underneath IT, I'd include those in an overhead category.
So this is not then I guess, well, let me ask this then. Where did you capture and where are they represented in this document? Costs related to the temporary move and permanent move?
In the individual departmental budgets. So for example, if an agency is moving to a leased space temporarily, we made an adjustment to accommodate that. So for example, Office of Budget Management staff. This year we were in the county admin building. So our budget had a charge for space because we were in county space. We're moving to Reserve Square Friday, actually. So going forward into 2014, our budget won't have a space charge because we're going to be in a leased building, but we will have a lease expense. So we did some refinement there to make sure that we no longer have a cost in that controlled services line of our budget, but we will have a cost in the contract line of our budget for the lease. So we made those changes line by line within the agency budgets that are impacted by the change in county space.
Then I asked Director Tim and Mr. Steen when he was here in the Board of Control, there was a discussion regarding these move costs and the related costs of the double move. And the discussion was that there would be a separate summary caption of all these related costs. I understand they'll be broken out to the individual department level, but do you have a cost code where you're able to at least run a report to show what the true cost at the end of the day?
For the interim move you're speaking of?
All moves.
Yes.
A total summary. So at the end, so say in July of next year when we're all in,
yes,
we can turn around and look back and say, well, we actually spent X between September, I think is when the first people started moving out, and July when the last group moved in, or August.
Yeah, in our budget development, actually, we have set up coding, not just the total level expenditure, but the changes. We are capturing both the interim move changes, but also the headquarter related changes to the budget with separate budget codes, if you will. So we are able to provide that information.
Okay, great. And I have more questions, but I'll hold them.
Okay. Ms. Simon, do you have any questions? Who else has questions for this round, for this presentation today? Anyone else? Councilman Greenspan.
Oh, okay. On page 5, I kind of went as you were presenting it, and I was writing notes. So, and I'm trying to get my mind caught up. I was anticipating having some more time to come back to this line, this thought, but let me ask you this. You said in the beginning, in the first line, that there were 24.2 million in 2014 and 25.6 million. It's kind of as where you started the budget?
Yeah, because we go back to, let me jump back. This parameter slide, that's a very automated and technical way we build our starting base budget data set. It's not accurate because we have to go in and do this whole refinement process. So when we jump to step 2, what we're calling base budget refinement, where we're adding things that should be in there, making sure we're capturing, it's more of a zero-based approach to the budget. That 24 million is actually adjustments that are made to make sure we're accurate. So they're not increases to the appropriate level or approved level of activity for any program budget. They're realignments and really a way to reconcile and refine the budget so it lines up with what the expectation is and what the approved spending authority has been for a particular county agency or program. So those are the numbers, high level, that types of we made decreases in other areas too, but that's really the net impact, and that's off of the starting initial base budget. So that's before we even got into what the real budget or real base budget is. Once we have all these adjustments in, we're at what we would call the base budget, really a status quo budget. If we get everyone up to where they should be, based on all the information we know, that final base budget, including those adjustments on this slide, would represent the final base.
The reason I ask, because outside of the Board of Developmental Disabilities, all of those other items are somewhat, I use that word loosely when you look at the prosecutor in there, are somewhat under our administrative control.
Yes.
How does the Department of Developmental Disability with that 15.9, is that a component of the 24.2?
No. Well, no, it's not actually. That's independent of the 24.2. Because that one, they communicate their budget to us. We have to take our starting point and make it match the Board of Developmental Disabilities planned budget for 14.
Okay.
So that one, I wouldn't even, they have autonomy to develop their own budget.
Right.
So that 15.9 is purely technical. We have to make sure what we're going to be recommending to council for the board matches exactly what their board has adopted or is about to adopt. So that changes. The other stuff, aside from that one, are probably more germane to this discussion. We're making sure the base budget, the starting point plus these refinements, is as close to accurate as possible before we get to the last stage of the recommended budget development piece, which is adjustments upward or downward. And these adjustments aren't necessarily impacting a program or staffing. They're done to make sure the budget's accurate. The next step, the adjustment step, where we're making reductions or increases, that will have an impact on programs and policy and how many people an agency may be employed. So those carry more weight or heft to them when we make those. These, not so much.
Okay. On page 6, the balance of general fund over the biennium, 8.5 million is targeted cuts to executive agencies. You said the detail is where? Where can I find the 8.5 million?
We can walk through an example right now if you'd like.
Yeah,
in the book.
well, that's up to the chair. It was discussed earlier that wanted to be addressed today. This kind of segued into it.
Okay. Let me just cover, since we have the book in front of us. Table of contents provides you the different sections. The departmental sections, so we have a 2 to 3 page write-up on each department's budget, and those begin in section 3. So section 3, 4, 5, and 6 are the individual departmental write-ups. So if we pick one, let's go to, I'm going to go to County Sheriff, which is Roman numeral 4-24.
424.
And I pick County Sheriff because I know there's a lot going on there for 14 and 15. So you get to the section, and some of this may look familiar because we've employed a lot of these different graphics in charting before. So on page 424 at the top, you have what we call a header table. It's a summary of the budget. You know, we have prior year, we have the current budget for 13, but I want to jump to the middle. You can see the middle column, 2014 base budget. That's the starting, or the base budget after those adjustments and refinements that we made. In the case of the sheriff, we had explained there were about $1.5 million made. And then you can see there's a change column, 2013 to 14 change. And you can see for the sheriff, for the general fund budget, The $1.3 million increase from the 14 base to the 13 current budget. I want to jump ahead. If you go to the next page, or actually right below the pie charts, there's a table that describes what that 1.2 million, or actually for all funds, it was 201,000, describes what those changes were. So you can see how the 14 budget is different from the current budget. We give you a table that explains what those refinements were. And then on the next page, we give you an overview, and then we also describe if an agency had targeted reductions recommended for 14 and 15, those are described in a bulleted manner in that section that says recommended budget adjustments. You can see for the sheriff, there are 4 individual recommendations under that targeted budget adjustment section. So that gives you the detail. We have a staffing chart, key performance measures, and we also have pie charts. We're doing more of a narrative budget approach for this particular cycle. So instead of a bar chart, we're giving you the basic, where does the money come from, how is it spent type of pie chart. So more of a narrative type of application of that charting data. So that's how each section works. So every department has all these components in its individual corresponding section. So you can see what recommendations were made to change the budget. So you'll see 2 types of changes. How did the base budget change from 2013's budget? And then were there any targeted recommendations for cuts or increases? And that's what that second page covers. In many cases, there's a base budget for an agency and there are no recommendations to change the base budget. And we'll denote that.
And Director, why is the chart and the number on the bottom of the page on 4-24, why is that number not the same as the 2013 to 14 change on the top of the page?
It's the number we're presenting is the all funds number. So if you look across the third line of the header table at the top, the all funds, the change in the sheriff all funds budget, because the sheriff actually has multiple funding sources. Most of it's general fund. The change, when you look at the all funds budget, is $201,000 decrease, and that ties to the number at the bottom of that table.
Okay. I'm trying to go quickly here because we want to, I think, a little break between the meetings, but is there a roll-up or a dashboard that summarizes all?
Yes, we can give you information that shows that.
That'd be great if you can do that. And then I'm going to skip down just to my next, the second and last paragraph on page 6. It says area targeted for reductions include vacant positions, jail ops, contractual services, building maintenance, and so forth. On the vacant positions section, I'll end my questions here today on the vacant positions. Are we saying that, typically, I've said this before, a budget is is a financial measurement to an operational plan. Are we saying that we've adjusted the operational plan to go and reduce positions, reduce our scope of service delivery by eliminating positions? Is that what we're talking about here?
We're talking about positions that were in the 13 budget or 13 estimate for 13 or 14, removing those from the base budget. So reducing the amount of staff that can be brought on by a particular agency that has a targeted recommendation. So it's not playing with some floating vacancy number. It's actual positions were evaluated, and a determination was made, what's the financial impact, what's the programmatic impact, and how do those flow into our overall model, how we're going to balance the general fund. So it wasn't just a percentage cut of some vacancy rate.
No, I understand that. I guess my question is, if we're reducing staff that had a defined purpose within the organization, then we must be reducing the service delivery.
Not necessarily. It depends on the organization, but I don't think you're going to see very minimal impact with most of these recommendations.
Okay, that's where I was going. I just want to make sure that.
No, we're careful. We look at the vacancies because generally, firstly, is an agency able to accomplish what they need to do on a day-to-day basis, their critical priorities with the staff they have? If there are pending hires or something they're adding on, can they continue to accomplish their main or priority objectives without filling those positions? And that's what we looked at when we made the recommendations to the administration.
Great. I'll end I've got plenty more, but I'll end it right here.
Okay, we will close it for today on that note. On Thursday, we will have additional time if needed for questions on the overview. Has anybody signed in for public comment unrelated? No.
Not for this meeting.
Not for this, okay, fine. Okay, and is there a motion to adjourn? Second? All those in favor say aye. Aye, opposed, no. Thank you very much.